The Canon D30 was released back in the year 2000. Now, at the time, this cost around $3,000. Nowadays, you can find it used for about $50. So, just what do you get with this 22-year-old camera? Well, there's a 3.1 megapixel APS-C size sensor, an ISO range of 100 to 1600, and a 1.8-inch 118K LCD screen. Now, we have to be clear what camera we're talking about. There's always sort of confusion around this camera. Whenever you say D30, people always assume that you mean the 30D, which is a much newer camera than this. See, this was Canon's very first DSLR that they ever made by themselves. See, they had the DCS5 and the DCS3, but both of those were made in partnership with Kodak. They were basically Canon cameras with Kodak internals. The D30 was Canon's first camera just on its own. Build quality of the D30 is pretty solid. It's a little bit plasticky by modern standards because it's another one of those cameras that's kind of based on film cameras at the time, but it does have like metal internals, and the plastic on the outside, it's not a cheap plastic, it's a pretty sturdy, heavy-duty plastic. But having said that, overall the D30 feels really good in the hands. Storage media on the D30 is compact flash cards. Now, technically they accept up to about 2 gigabytes. You might be able to go a little bit higher than that, but truth be told, I tried a 4 gig and a 16 gig card and kind of had a little bit of trouble with like a card read error on here. Currently, I've been using a 512 megabyte card that I found in the bottom of a 10-year-old backpack. I don't know where this card actually came from. I think it might have come with my Canon 10D like 100 years ago. I honestly have no idea where I got this. The lens mount on this camera is an EF, even though it's a crop sensor camera. You've got to remember the EFS mount wasn't even invented until 3 years later in 2003. So if you have any EFS lenses, they're not going to work on this. It only takes EF lenses only. Top shutter speed on the D30 is 1/4000th of a second. If you're shooting on an f1.4 lens like this, you might want to consider an ND filter. I've noticed that there's been a lot of times in bright sunlight where trying to shoot wide open, and 1/4000th of a second just isn't quite fast enough in certain bright circumstances. Burst rate on the D30 is 3 frames per second up to 8 frames, so unfortunately, this might not be the sports and action camera that you had in mind. The menu system on the D30 is the classic Canon style, which ironically hasn't changed that much throughout the years. I mean, it looks very dated, but everything's kind of laid out the way that you're used to it being laid out. The only difference is it scrolls vertically instead of the tabs going left to right. Having said that, in the years that I've been using the D30, I haven't had any trouble finding anything in the menu system. Everything's pretty much exactly where you would expect it to be. You know, one thing I notice is the D30 is really highlight oriented. Like just in little situations like this where you're getting like these little bits of sunlight peeking through, that seems to be the main thing that the camera's fixated on. You know, so when you're watching the exposure in the viewfinder, it's telling you that you're way overexposed. And so when you go with that like sort of suggested exposure, then you see the image and it's like, wait, that's actually kind of dark. It is one of those cameras that is seemingly kind of preoccupied with protecting the highlights. So that is something to be mindful of. You know, based on a lot of the stuff that I've seen, especially even here just trying to take pictures of the sky, seems like the dynamic range on this camera isn't that great, but it is literally a 22-year-old camera, so you do kind of have to cut it some slack. I think the funny thing for me is, for a camera with literally 3 autofocus points, it's surprisingly not that bad. It's not going to be as crazy fast as a modern camera, but overall, I mean, just walking around and taking pictures like this, I haven't really had any problems with misfocus. Here's my take on the autofocus. If you're a portrait photographer, yeah, you're probably going to have trouble nailing focus on someone's eye. I mean, you might even be better off just using manual focus. And if you're a sports shooter, that action is going to be moving way too fast. You're probably going to miss that. But for general, like everyday use, like just walking around like the neighborhood taking pictures like this, autofocus is perfectly fine and perfectly usable. By the way, for anyone who hasn't used the D30 in a while, or maybe you've just never used it before, the autofocus points aren't the way they are in a modern camera. You know, you hear the beep beep noise and it highlights in green whichever point is selected. With this, you know, you've got the 3 points that you're looking at in the viewfinder, and what it's actually highlighting is down below that. There's a 1, 2, 3 dots, and it's a potential of only one of those is highlighted or all 3 are highlighted. You know, point being, that's kind of what you're keeping an eye on whenever you take a picture. You know, if what you're looking at is in the center of the frame, kind of look down at those little dots and see, because if it's the dot over on the left, that means it's choosing the autofocus point on the left, and same way if it's the dot on the right, so on and so forth. Because that's the thing. The dots that you're actually watching, that you're used to watching, the 3 squares in the middle, those don't light up at all. Those aren't doing anything. So it's just something to keep in mind if you're used to modern cameras. So is the Canon D30 worth it in 2022? And the short answer is, yeah, definitely. I mean, it takes great pictures and it only costs $50. It's almost like you need to think of the D30 this way. Back when that camera first came out, I remember how genuinely excited I was, as were most photographers. You know, the D30 was a really big deal. It was a pretty professional camera. Now, in the 22 years that would follow, certainly our technology has improved a great deal. You know, we have more megapixels, we have better autofocus, and we have LCD screens that my aging eyesight can actually see. But don't let that take away from the D30. The D30 hasn't gotten any worse in the past 22 years. It's just that our technology has gotten better around it. The point being, it's still good for its most basic functions, what is just taking good pictures. So yeah, if you're already a Canon shooter and you have a bunch of EF lenses, sure, why not? Just check it out. It's only $50. Or if you use Sony or Nikon or some other system and you're just curious about old Canon cameras, sure, give it a try. You know, it's only $50, and for another $50, you can just find a kit lens or maybe even like a 50mm f1.8, and there you go. $100, you've got a whole setup. It's definitely worth checking out. Anyway, I think that's all I've got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.